Am I live? All right. Yes, I'm live. All right. So, welcome to BSides Pyongyang. My name is Bryson Bort. I'll be standing in for Kim Jong Un on the illustrious keynote here. And before we start and we get into character, I wanted to say a few things. So, first of all, welcome. This was a fun event that we put together, and I want to stipulate how we are using the North Korean Hermit Kingdom uh, to be the theme for this. Back to my time as an Army officer and the work that I've done in the U.S. government, I'd like to point out we should never look down upon our adversaries. Um, don't think they're crazy. They just have a different value system. They work differently. So try not to dehumanize. That's not the intent of this conference. We're just using a little bit of humor of them. In addition, I'd like to announce we had a lot of ticket sales, so thank you all for joining us today. And we are going to be donating a portion of the um, proceeds for this conference to refugees and defectors from North Korea. So quick introduction on me. I'm Bryson. My full-time job is I'm the founder and CEO of Scythe. We're a breach and attack simulation, a threat emulation platform that's run out of an offensive consultancy I founded called Grim. And then I'm the co-founder of a nonprofit called the ICS Village. You probably have seen us at DEF CON. Me and Tom Van Norman run that. So without further ado, I'm going to now be in character for the keynote. If I can advance my slide. There we go. Okay. So, first of all, you'll notice that I am standing in for our illustrious dear leader, Kim Jong Un, who we would like to inform you there are no issues and everything is doing fine. See this completely natural picture of him among the people watching the news today. And on that note, I am going to award myself my first medal for doing a good job of kicking off this keynote. So, good job, me. I get the red star. Okay. So this keynote is the most glorious update on behalf of dear leader, brought to you by your three-star North Korean general, Bryson Bort. So storms have two results: to destroy what isn't solid, to reveal what is. This is our strategy, comrades. I have here on the right a snapshot from the World Economic Forum listing all of the global risks and the interconnections of those global risks. Using the not so subtle nuclear symbol, I have highlighted all of these interconnected risks that tie to the cybersecurity domain. And that is going to be the intent of today's presentation to you, is we are going to analyze the degenerate Western capitalist defensive ecosystem, showing what we do, what works, what we're going to continue to do that works, and why it works. And on that note, I think I've earned another medal. So you're the storm. How would you attack the United States or the country of your choice? So there's this concept, a book that was published in 2022 called Cyber Persistence Theory. I have a link down here at the bottom for those who would like to get a book review from the Army Cyber Institute's Cyber Defense Review, where the Yankee military analyzes this new concept. One of the challenges that we have in our space is whether you are working as a civilian in your enterprise. We are a military and intelligence organization that is targeting you. That's new territory. There aren't a lot of other disciplines, whether you're a public or private institution, that have to deal with this. And so there's always been this concept of, well, where exactly does cybersecurity fit within geopolitics, the ability for establishing nation state effect, and what is kind of the game theory and how this stuff works. So one of the things it posits is that there are effectively three different components of warfare. Kinetic, which we all understand, and is the traditional air, space, land, sea, and cyber being a purported fifth domain, but that's not really working as a fifth domain the way we're seeing it. Then there's nuclear, which represents its own asymmetric advantage because by investing in that kind of capability, we are able to overcome a kinetic disadvantage. And then finally, fitting into a third category is cyber, where we're able to establish an asymmetric advantage, where we're able to do just about anything up to a purported red line without getting a response from any of our enemies. This is working really well for us in North Korea. So the reason for this is that cyber exploits this asymmetric advantage. Why go up against the US military? Why go up against a nuclear arsenal with mutually assured destruction when I'm able to, for relatively cheap, train lots of operators to be able to conduct these operations on our behalf against your country and the economies of your country without fear of much reprisal? Funny enough, these same operators, we're okay with them in their free time moonlighting and doing crypto crime. So we transition from military operator to then straight up crime in the off hours. So some more clouds in the storm. So we covered why cyber because the return on investment for our offensive investment is outsized. But we're not alone in doing this in North Korea. And so some of the ways that it's been expressed to look at how these threats operate. China is like climate change. Russia and Iran are like hurricanes. And then I've deemed North Korea more like overnight rain. And I don't mean that in the sense of downplaying it, just in terms of the scope of what we're seeing. It's more on the nuisance and fraud category, which we're going to tie into the motives of what we're doing that explains that. So, threat motives. Um, so, Bryson, in his real world form, has often joked that the primary cybersecurity motive for North Korea is to secure Western luxury goods and waiting for a dear leader. Something a lot of folks don't know about me is I actually grew up in Germany and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And so I had a firsthand account at seeing how these kinds of repressive authoritarian regimes needed to operate to be able to function on the world stage. I mentioned earlier how cybersecurity is an easy way to advance our national military and intelligence operations through this, which that seems like a good reason to give me another role. Good job, me. Go strategy. All right. How do my middle stuff, team? The point being is that military and intelligence operations require hard currency. For me to be able to buy cloud for gray infrastructure, to buy exploits, to invest in that kind of technology, the currency of the world is US dollars. So we have to find a way to get access to those kinds of hard currency to give us freedom of investment for freedom of action in our military and intelligence operations. In addition, our country's economy has not been doing well as we would like. We slightly acknowledge that. And so these kinds of investments help us also with continuing to secure military and intelligence loyalty for what we're trying to do. We talked about three kinds of uh, tech or spaces under cyber persistence theory. Espionage helps us with our nuclear ambitions because we can't invest in building this directly. This kind of technology has been, through treaty, held away from us. Therefore, espionage is one of our best ways of fomenting our nuclear ambitions to build up along that third pillar under persistent theory. And then, as we noted, between the IT workers that your companies have been fortunate enough to hire, sending us currency, our cyber operators also moonlight doing cryptocurrency crime in their free time. One of the things that we've noticed is that there's two kinds of organizations in the world, those that give medals and those that don't. But seriously, there's those where leadership cares about security and those that don't care about security. And that's an intentionally spicy comment on purpose. It's not that leadership doesn't care about security, it's that they care about compliance first. Compliance is how your decadent regulatory compliance capitalist organization continues to function. You have to do it. Security is a critical thinking process that your leaders may or may not invest on top of that. We love the kinds of companies that only look at compliance because those are the table stakes that we're training before we deploy our operation. We know we're going to succeed before we start. So one of the things that we're hoping that the defenders in this capitalist regime don't figure out is how to work with leadership to move beyond compliance for that security investment, because that's going to make it, as Andrew Thompson at Google calls it, imposing cost on us. And we don't like to have that cost imposed. We're looking for the easiest target. So if you're just doing compliance, you're going to be an easy target for us. And yet, Why do we continue to achieve such glorious success against the defender? One of the philosophies that we see in the defensive ecosystem that leads to this failure is a singular system focus. When you are releasing things in the environment, when you are testing things going to an environment, we've noticed that oftentimes the vulnerability management, the individual system penetration test looks at a system in isolation. When the reality is, except for the fact that we only have 1,024 IP addresses for the entire address space of the internet in North Korea. It seems like many capitalist regimes have systems connected to other systems, and they're interconnected. Well, wouldn't you know that those connections lead to weaknesses? Have you seen where Log4j is, right? The supply chain is a huge part of where we continue to take advantage of the defensive ecosystem. So the defender, what aren't you accounting for? So besides Elon Musk being the thing that nobody ever accounts for, which I think is worth another medal, I'm going to assume a few of you laughed at that joke or that picture, is we noticed that the defense organizations tend to rely on the user and subject them to phishing training and trying to avoid our glorious initial active attempts into breaking into your enterprises. Well, if the user can click one of our emails and burn your enterprise to the ground, we would argue that that is a mistake on a defensive staff, and they need to be looking at how they can defend the ecosystem in this system of systems approach, accounting for how regular users actually are using systems. So, what is cybersecurity? This is one of my favorite questions, and I never fail whenever I give it to the beaming school children in North Korea, because this is where we get to point out that cybersecurity is measured by us. In this discipline, you spend all of this engineering trying to achieve an outcome where the outcome is ultimately measured by what we get to do to it. And that's how that's going. So let's go through some definition, which I think is worth another. Now we're going to work on my health. It feels like a good place to do it. So a threat starts with hostile intent. Somebody has to want to do something. Been talking about our movement, so we clearly have intent. There's something we want to do. Well, in my long history as a North Korean military officer, having fought in the great spam wars of the 90s, having gone through the crypto crime spree of 2017 to 2019, which those medals are all the way down there. Intent is not enough. We need capability. Capability is those pictures of those operators that you're trained and ready to do something with the tools, exploits, training, and infrastructure that we accomplish, that we have. This is how we enable them to accomplish their mission. So that's us. That's the threat. One of the things that has always irked me is there's this aphorism that gets thrown around that attackers only need to be right once and defenders need to always be right. And it's not true. And this diagram helps us understand that. Because once an attacker breaks into your infrastructure and breaches it, we need to be right every single time. One little mistake, one piece of noise that gives up the jig, and we're done and we're out. Now, when we talk about that perspective of the defender always needing to be right and the attacker only being once, I think that's typically what folks are just looking at what it takes to break in. I only need one opportunity to break in. We have an expression in the intelligence community. I can't create an asset. I can't make somebody betray their country. I can't make you give me a vulnerability in a computer. But what I can do is take advantage of psychological weaknesses or vices or the lack of hygiene in your organization to make sure that these vulnerabilities continue to be there. So the defender controls a third of this equation on what the threat can do because our focus on that hygiene for surface area reduction and building up detection and response helps to mitigate what the threat is. And then a decadent capitalist CEO, who is the founder of Bugcrowd, Casey Ellis, defines this in a pithy Western decadent way. A threat actor is someone who wants to punch you in the face. The threat is the punch being thrown. The vulnerability is your inability to block the punch. And the risk is your likelihood of getting punched in the face. So I came up with this model which simplifies, right? You hear MITRE ATT&CK, Lockheed Martin, kill chain. And the reason I came up with BAM is I wanted a simple way to be able to look at the phases of how an attack happens. And most of an attack was actually in the reconnaissance, building up the target package, going on LinkedIn, determining the relationships, doing the OSINT on who you are, figuring out all the defensive tools that are in your stack because your job descriptions at your company tell me what tools are there. I build this great target package. And that sucks for the defender, but there's not a lot that you can do about it. And going back to the threat perspective, that's the threat before they've taken advantage of an opportunity. Once they take advantage of the opportunity, the breach, that's the initial access. And short of denial of service, and where we're starting to see the rise of malwareless attacks with identity-based approaches, there's not a lot of organizational impact because that initial shell, which I get from initial code execution, is just giving me the opportunity to do more. I actually don't know everything once I breached you. I figured out what domain I'm in. I recognize I'm on a host. Now I need to do further reconnaissance to be able to determine skill credentials and move through your environment to accomplish my objective. Well, that's the actions and effects um, on objective phase. So that's the final phase here. That's where all the organizational impact is. That's where I'm making my proverbial money. And then going back to our threat diagram, that's you, the defender, have the control over everything I'm doing. I'm only hacking your computers. I'm not bringing my own computer to the game. Those computers only talk through the communication protocols that are already embedded to the environment, and it's only your users that are using them. I have to follow those rules. Anything else I do, I'm going to stick out and I'm going to get caught. So, talking to critical infrastructure, which has been getting a lot of attention in the Western media in the past few years. So, let's start with what is an industrial control system? Looking at an average computer, how can I tell it's an industrial control system? It's any computer that's at least 20 years old. So the tongue-in-cheek joke here is understanding the life cycle, the legacy elements, and how difficult it is to secure by design or introduce security into an ecosystem that is working from these host components. It's gonna take a long time to do that. So how does the electric grid work? So I'm gonna take a broad perspective on how the West got here. Back in the 70s, electricity was generated, transmitted, distributed, and it was a one-way thing. Then we started to introduce solar power, and suddenly the physics went both directions, where folks that are consumers on the grid are now able to push electricity back. While that might seem simple, the physics required computers to make it work. Well, when we add computers to anything, what have we done? We've added surface area. And surface area is now the initial risk that we're starting to face because when you put things on the internet, it turns out that those two great oceans that defend the United States get rendered to nothing. And I now have direct access to seeing the articles where somebody has run census in Shodan. And I see that there are 40,000 water utilities with key computers directly connected to the internet. This surface area is what's driving this question. But what's driving the surface area besides the electric grid metaphor is money. It is convenient, it is functional, and one of the interesting things about the United States critical infrastructure grid is 85% of it is managed by private industry, which means you don't actually have a strong government presence to drive the public good. Instead, it has to work through market factors, while at the same time, as you think about the not haves like a electric co-op or a small water utility, they their revenue is rate-based constrained. They can only get the money from the community that's supporting them, and you can't really raise taxes on a small base like that, which I think earns another red star because that is one of the weaknesses that we're exploiting to be able to establish levers for action inside your critical infrastructure. So how does an attack work in critical infrastructure? Industrial control systems, we have this nominal enterprise architecture called the Purdue model. Don't worry. What I'm going to do is break down this model in a very simple understanding. So first is we have IT. Every large modern business in the Western world has IT to conduct billing, administration, making the organization run. There is always some connection from IT into the operational technology environment. So an air gap is not an air gap is not an air gap. There's always some connection for some reason there. That level of the operations technology environment is this sort of shared service model where there's common routing, common things like file servers, or email, whatever I might need to operate my devices that are in operation down at these lower levels. I have the shared service model that's providing them all. Then I have what are called control zones. So I establish essentially inherent fire breaks between workflows that are doing physical processes so that if there's a problem here, it's not a cascading effect to impact the others, where you can see the clear cybersecurity advantages to that kind of approach. Well, the problem is, look at this from an attack perspective, what looks like that defense in depth collapses for the following reasons. First of all, the most common access vector into OT is still through IT. Turns out the same thing that allows me to phish and compromise your generic IT organization is the same way that I'm going to compromise your average critical asset owner, because they have that IT as well, doing what IT does. Pivot laterally, cross over, and take over those high-level industrial control systems. I have a link here to an article written by Megan Stamford, who's a chief product security officer at one of the major OT manufacturers, that breaks down this model in further detail. So the first is IT into OT, and all that hard work I did to break through what is typically a modern IT, going back to the fact the high-level industrial control systems are 20 years old. I'm going to be taking over a feed generation old Linux or Windows machine. I don't need to understand any of the crazy OT protocols. I don't need to know anything special. I'm now able to take that over, tell it what to do, and I'm able to compromise the low-level industrial control system. The second access method is what we mentioned earlier, which is a direct access from the internet into the OT environment. That should be managed by hygiene and proper remote access. And then finally, last on the list is going to be supply chain interdiction or close access, where I'm able to get somebody to plug something in directly to one of your low-level devices, which is very similar to the Stuxnet operation in 2012 on the Natanz uranium enrichment facility, where a USB stick with Stuxnet malware was introduced into that system. So one of the good things, besides me getting another medal, is I did a talk with Chris Krebs when he was the director of CISA at RSA back in 2020 called TLP Red Pants, which is a joke off of TLP Red. And as you can see, we're both wearing red pants. One of the challenges that cybersecurity professionals in the Western world have, because this is not an authoritarian government dictated thing and critical infrastructure is primarily run by private industry, is how do we educate leadership and the citizens on these problems? Well, no good crisis can go to waste. And Colonial Pipeline in 2021, which cut out gas to American citizens in the southeast United States, was a wake-up call. After that, ransomware became what I would call a kitchen word. Your average Western grandmother now knows what ransomware is. She may not understand technically how to explain ransomware, but she knows what ransomware is, which means Western leadership now understands what ransomware is. We love ransomware because it is one of the easiest ways for us to affect getting hard currency. I shut down a number of hosts in your company, you're going to pay me. The other one that we've been doing is fraud in the cryptocurrency world and general online fraud, which has been increasing. We've recently become aware of an Army Cyber Institute project called Jack Voltaic, where they did an exercise which we would determine how to defeat a modern military. Going back to our cyber deterrence theory or persistence theory, we know we can't go up against the US military directly. And so what we've looked at is, well, what is cyber's involvement in the force projection of Western military forces? And here's a link to it. And the analysis that came from Jack Voltaic is that you can, in fact, delay force projection without directly targeting military networks. It turns out there's a whole of community vulnerability for the US military, where while US forces might be safely ensconced inside of a post, for them to get somewhere else in the world requires a heavy dependence on civilian critical infrastructure. And the same way that those communities look at natural disasters is actually more secure in the way they look at a cyber response, which an enemy would intentionally be driving. One of the reasons for that is that cyber incident identification and declaration, anything below what would be a catastrophic threshold where there is like red lights and air signs going, the communities don't respond to these incidents well in a cohesive manner. And when we've seen military exercises that are doing this, they tend to cut these out which means that we're not able to test the flexibility of participation that is needed for a proper response. Because it turns out the best tank to fight is the tank that never shows up on the battlefield. So some more references here, going back to Bryson. He gave a talk where he looked how IoT and IIoT is essentially an invisible asset class of vulnerability that organizations are ignoring, and it isn't a privacy concern. Now, since demonstrated by the GRU and numerous military and intelligence organizations after my 2018 talk at RSA, link there, I showed how you can take advantage of IoT resources and pivot in to cause great damage. And then Grim was actually hired to do an assessment on the DJI drones, looking at the source code. And there was it was actually a front page New York Times article where we showed a number of these coding practices led to the backdoors that we've been seeing in this technology, which is particularly frightening if you're in the United States because over 90% of domestic law enforcement has been using DJI drones for their purposes. So, summary of our advantages that we're seeing. Because surface area is growing faster than the control structures that Western defenses are able to put in place, we are seeing more opportunities to take advantage of vulnerabilities to advance our goals. Artificial intelligence, whatever you want to debate about it, I think that's worth another medal for saying AI, is going to make it harder for the defender because it's increasing that surface area and is invisible the same way that cloud adoption has been driving it. Cyber risk is still number 3 or greater on most organizational priorities in capitalist companies. And we're still not seeing the integrated security processes of where all of this is coming through to bring security in earlier and throughout the process. As a result, the defenders' OODA loop of decision making is slower than it needs to be, and it instead seems to be providing a lot of band-aids instead of systemic solutions, which we continue to take advantage of. Some more resources for those who are looking at it. The nonprofit ICS Village is always putting out content. We host an annual policy conference on critical infrastructure called Critical Effect in Washington, D.C., which is a hybrid event every spring. And then we have a monthly podcast called Hack the Plant, which turns out is very popular in Russia. That is our number 2 population. So we must be doing something right on critical infrastructure. And with that, thank you so much for joining us today at BSides Pyongyang. I'm glad to have been your host. See you around.